Listen, I was praying really strongly. I really felt strongly like I need to, before we get into the message, communicate something important. We're talking about offense, and I just realized sometimes offenses happen because of lack of communication. And I want to make sure there isn't one. And let me just start with this. I know there are a lot of pastors out there who, whenever something goes on in the media or in our world, they're on there making comments about it, and we should do this, and we should focus on this. I know there's a lot of pastors who then take those things that are happening in the world, and then all of a sudden they show up on Sunday, and then they preach about those things. And you may have noticed that that's not me. That I really don't do that. And so I really want to explain just for a moment why. And it really it's been a deliberate and prayerful decision I've made, at least on the social media that I am on, that I keep it to really focusing on encouragement and biblical truth, and that's it. And so I don't make comments. I don't comment on people's Facebook pages even that are making comments about things. And I have just decided, this isn't the place to hash those things out, at least for me. I don't have any problem with anybody else who does that, but I just want you to know, if you will go to my Facebook page, you're not going to see any of that stuff. It's intentional, but I'm not ignoring it. I also realize this: if I post on things and then I don't post on other things, people then assume my silence means something when I don't post on things. So it really is intentional and it's strategic. I don't want to offend people just in general because social media does that all the time. But listen, I also have prayerfully prayed about just not letting the winds of whatever is going on and happening in our culture to dictate what we tackle on Sunday mornings. It's not that the Bible doesn't speak to our culture, because I hope you see that. It certainly does. I just choose to let the series we're in and the passages we're studying to just come out in such a timely manner that I believe it addresses what we're going on in our culture. But I strive to let the Bible speak into our culture, not the culture dictate what we study in the Bible. And that's my approach. There's nothing wrong with any other approach. Other pastors that do it a different way, they're not doing anything wrong either. They're just doing it differently. But I want you to know where I'm coming from, why we're doing things the way we do that, because it's just my focus. We have Bible studies and times of fellowship that we certainly can talk about the issues. We should be talking about the issues we see in the news, but I have loved seeing how God will take a series or verses we're in and apply it to what's going on in the world around us and the culture we're living in. In fact, our current series is case in point. And maybe you don't know it, but I want to we're talking about the trap of offense and how destructive it is when we let it grow. And this last week, we saw this played out. I told you, we live in an offendable culture. Everyone's offended, and people are offended all the time, and then they start nursing those offenses. It ends up hurting a lot of people. And we saw this past week, it led to somebody being murdered because they were offended by what somebody else had to say. And I know that's an extreme case of what happens when we allow offense to take root in our lives. For you and me, maybe it's not literal murder, but how many friendships, how many relationships have we killed off because of an offense? So it's totally relevant. And I've been really saddened by this. I've been saddened by looking at social media and seeing more and more offenses are being taken instead of healing and wholeness coming in through this horrible thing. And so in many ways, this current series is perfect for us. It's here at the right time, building up our faith so we can be guarded from the destructive nature of offenses, so we're not taking on these offenses. And so I just wanted to let you know where I'm coming from. I'm not ignoring the news or the media or the culture we're living in. I just am taking a different approach. So let's get into today's message. If you weren't here last week, I'm just going to do a brief overview because we're really going to be building off of these blocks every week. And we already learned, quite frankly, that not taking offense is not the easiest thing to do, right? And so if you remember, one of the key verses we looked at last week is Luke 17:5. Lord, increase our faith. But if you were here last week, you also know why the disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith. It was because, Jesus is teaching them, and he's saying, hey, if somebody offends you basically or hurts your feelings, forgive them. And you're like, okay, well, it happens once, good, I can forgive that. But then Jesus goes the next step and says, listen, if it happens 7 times in a day, guess what? Every time they come to you, you need to forgive. And the disciples are like, all right, Jesus, you went a little too far on that one. Now, if I'm going to forgive that many times in a day, there's something supernatural I need because I can't do that. So increase my faith, right? And so we see how important this is, and just going through this, we need God to increase our faith. One of the reasons we do in a series on offense is that one message, I know this, it begins to stir your faith, right? And hopefully your faith was stirred last week to see something needs to change in my life. But a lot of times it's not enough to change. One message isn't going to get you to really change anything that's going on in your life. And so we need to constantly, the Bible teaches us this, Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing the word of God over and over again. The more you're in it, the more you hear it, the more God is growing your faith so that you can put into practice what he is telling you to do. And so that's what we're going to do. Throughout this series, we're going to be growing our faith so that we're able to not just see the changes that need to be made, but to make the changes that need to be made so we don't even take the bait of offense. So last week we talked about 3 common ways that offenses tend to happen. The first is they're real offenses, right? Somebody meant to hurt me, and so that's the first one. They did us wrong. The second kind was this idea of perceived offenses, right? In this case, nobody actually intended wrong, but you perceive they did, and because of that, the danger of those things is perceived offenses, you carry them as real offenses. So it didn't matter if it really happened or not. If you're carrying a perceived offense, it happened. And that offense is real in your life. And then the third one, which was, again, I like the most because I see this, I actually don't like it, but I see it the most. And it is, we're not even offended, but we know somebody who is. So we take on their offense. And it really is kind of stupid when you think about it, but that is so much. And honestly, many of us are in danger of doing this even in the events of this week. We're reading all kinds of opinions, all kinds of angles that may not even be true, quite frankly, and we're taking an offense in light of them and carrying something that we shouldn't. Now, the Bible's clear that we're going to be offended, right? We talked about that. Why? Well, because we're all sinners. So somebody's going to offend you, you're going to offend others, it's going to happen. So the real question is, what do we do with an offense when it comes? And every time, I want you to know you have a choice. You can take the offense, and you can nurse it, or you can release it back to God. But here's what's at stake. Hebrews 12:15. Make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble and defiling many. When we nurse an offense, we allow that offense to take root in our lives and lead us to be bitter towards the person who's offended us. But it's even worse, because that bitterness doesn't always stop at that person. It begins to negatively affect every relationship we have. And it creeps into all of our relationships. We looked at the 2 examples last week of how to handle offense. One was David, King David, and the other one was Jesus. And both of them entrusted their lives to God instead of taking matters into their own hands, because they had real offenses done against them and they could have justified it, but they didn't. And we're called to follow in the steps of Jesus. So we read this last week, 1 Peter 2:21. To this you were called because Jesus suffered for you, leaving you an example that, what? We should follow in his steps. So just so we're clear on the context, of following Jesus and the kind of suffering he talks about, look at verse 23 again, drop down. It says, when they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, here's the key, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. And the offenses to Jesus were real. Yet what did Jesus do? He entrusted himself to his Father who judges justly all these things. And today we're going to look at one more example of that. And it's probably the biggest key to avoiding taking the bait of offense is what we see patterned in these three people's lives over and over. We entrust ourselves to God, who's able to judge every situation justly. But again, that of course takes faith, right? And so we all need this prayer, Lord, increase my faith, right? And I just pray that that's what you're praying throughout this series, Lord, increase my faith. The example we're going to look at today is found in the Old Testament by a guy by the name of Joseph. He's one of my favorite people in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. His story takes up 13 chapters in Genesis. So you got Genesis 37 through 50 covering his life story. And so he's interesting because we probably get more of an in-depth look at this man than almost any other person in the Bible. And the reason why I love Joseph's story so much is because most of us, I think, can relate. Here's a guy who's trying to live right and do right, and he keeps getting the raw deal of life. Anybody ever feel that way? You're trying to do right, and the things just aren't working out. And that's what we really see in Joseph. But at the other end of the spectrum is this. What you end up seeing in his life is he never seems to get angry at the people doing him wrong. He never gets angry at God. He never seems to blame God. He never even seems to question God. He simply remains entrusted to God through it all. God, I'm trusting you with my life. And I have loved studying his life because I think that's the goal we should have. God, I don't care what happens to me. I just want to live faithfully for you, no matter what comes my way. And when it comes to offense, listen, Joseph, he didn't have an easy life. He had so many reasons to be offended throughout his life story, and he doesn't seem to take the bait. So let's talk about some of these. Remember this, for you individually too. We all have opportunities to be offended, but we don't have to take the bait. You have the opportunities, but you don't have to take the bait. So look at Joseph. To understand his life, I think we need to understand a little bit of the family dynamics that are going on. So in case you don't know his story, bear with me a little bit. Joseph's dad was a guy by the name of Jacob, and Jacob had two wives who actually were sisters, Leah and Rachel. Anybody see a problem with that probably happening? So you got two wives. Jacob always loved Rachel. And somehow, and that's a whole nother story we're not going to get into it, somehow on his wedding day, the father-in-law switched the bride, and he ends up marrying Leah instead of Rachel, and then he gives Jacob a second wife. He gives him Rachel. So Jacob, though, always loved Rachel. He didn't really love Leah at all. And so Jacob has the two wives, and I want you to understand that when the Bible talks about these things, it's not promoting them all the time. It's telling you what happened in real life. God actually has taught us in Scripture that marriage is to be between one man and one woman, and that's it. You weren't supposed to have multiple wives. And everywhere you see people not following God's plans, there's a lot of family problems in their lives because of it. And that's the point, kind of. Is this. When you don't follow God's plans, you mess it all up. And not only your relationship, but every relationship around you tends to suffer because of it. So it's not endorsing having more than one wife in any way, shape, or form. But listen, in Jacob's case, he loves Rachel, and Leah feels unloved. And in this scenario, Rachel can't get pregnant, but Leah seems to get pregnant easily, and it never seems to, though, do the thing she's hoping it does, which is win the affection of her husband to herself. And so finally, after Leah has had 6 kids, and again, this is another story that we'll get into sometime down the road, but 4 more kids are actually born through their servants. So Jacob's a busy man here. And Rachel, though, after 10 kids, finally gets pregnant. And this child that is born is Joseph. And Jacob loves him more than his 10 other brothers. He even gives him a special coat of many colors. Now, you can imagine how much these 10 brothers hate Joseph. But let me ask you a question. Why do they hate Joseph? You know, the truth of the matter is Joseph didn't do anything. They're offended by the dad. It is the dad's love that they're after, and Joseph is stealing what they think is their love. But the offense towards Joseph becomes real. Even though Joseph wasn't the problem, Joseph never offended them. He never did anything to deserve it. But because they perceived Joseph was the cause of their hurt, everything he did became suspect and continued to build up that offense and that bitterness towards Joseph over and over and over again. So one day Joseph, he has a dream. He tells his brothers he's in a position of authority and they're bowing down to him. And if you're not carrying an offense and your little brother tells you that, you might pat him on the back and go, "Nice dream, buddy." Right? But if you're offended, what do? What they did. They hated him. And that dream just drilled this hatred more and more and more in their heart. Well, who does he think he is that we're going to be bowing down to him? Dude, it was just a dream. Let it go. He's little. But they don't do that. Why? They're offended by him. And so they nurse that hate. And so on another day, the father sends Joseph to check on his brothers, and they put him in a pit. And they have every intention on killing this guy. Except it just so happens that a foreign caravan comes along and they're like, "Hey, we can make some money off of him instead. Let's just sell him into slavery rather than kill him." And being sold as a slave meant a lot, because that meant Joseph lost his name. It meant he lost his inheritance. It meant that if he ever did get married, guess what? His wife had to become a slave, and any kids they had became slaves. And so literally, by selling him into slavery, his brothers destroyed his life. And Joseph gets to Egypt. Then he's sold to a guy named Potiphar. And what we see in Joseph is something interesting. Instead of being offended, Joseph seems to just be bouncing back and going, "Okay, God, I'm here. I'm going to serve Potiphar with all of my heart." And he just serves well. And God blesses Potiphar in light of Joseph serving him. And we see him elevated. And so so things are good for a while with Joseph. And all of a sudden, one day, his Potiphar's wife starts hitting on Joseph. And he's like, "Come on, stay away from me, woman." And she just keeps hitting on him. And one day he walks into the house, nobody's around. And she's like, "Come to bed with me." And he's like, "I'm out of here." And he runs away. Listen, she grabs his coat and screams and accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. Now you can imagine Potiphar is extremely offended, right? But why is he offended? Because of a perceived offense. You and I know Joseph did nothing. In fact, he honored Potiphar by not doing anything with his wife. But his wife convinced Potiphar, Joseph is not a good man. And so Joseph is now thrown into prison for doing the right thing. I just kind of want to stop here. We're going to explore some of the things that God is doing in Joseph's life through all of this. And one of the reasons why I want to pull back here is look behind the scenes at Joseph's life is because it's really hard to do in our own lives, right? So one of the reasons God gives us these stories of real people in the Bible and what they went through is to help us be able to see what God is doing behind the scenes, because we get to see the end story in Joseph's life. The problem with our own lives is we're in the middle of it and we can't see the end, and so it makes it really hard to trust God when we have no idea what he's doing in the middle of it all. So in Joseph's life, we could see that God is using these opportunities for him to be hurt and offended to actually shape Joseph and set him up for something good. And here's a principle you need to remember as you go through life. What God allows into our lives is meant, first of all, to build our character, and second, to test our character. Amen. First, to build it, and second, to test it. Now, you and I mean, we don't like to focus on this, but character is not built through easy things. It's built when life gets tough. For example, it's not hard to be nice to people who are nice to you, right? It's not hard at all. That doesn't show you have any character. In fact, Jesus even says it this way, Matthew 5:47, if you're kind only to your friends, how are you any different than anyone else? Even pagans do that. No brainer, being nice is nice. But the test of character comes in when people that are not nice to you, you are nice to anyways. See, in truth, the only way you could see if you have a strong character is when it's tested in ways that says, normal people don't act like this, right? And all of a sudden, you begin acting as God would have you act. And it's seen in how you respond when people aren't nice to you. And as Christians, you and I should have an eye opened, okay, what is God doing as life and trials come our way to shape me in the character that I have? In fact, James 1:2-4 says this: "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let your endurance have its full effect so that you may be mature, complete, lacking nothing." Listen, the problem is that when we're going through the test, most of us aren't going, "Yay, joy! I'm building character," right? We're not doing that. Yet I guarantee this: every one of us who have gone through painful things in our lives and we've seen God shape and mold our character, when we look back, we could say, "Thank you, God. Thank you for that." Why? Because God took and strengthened you through these trials. And so let me ask you a question. If your faith never really faces any trials, how much faith do you really have? We don't think about that very often. But most of the people that I know who have a strong faith also have stories to tell of strong tests that they went through to get that faith. It didn't come easily. And those tests often come through people who have done us wrong and hurt us. And once again, we can see this battle. We talked about this last week. It's spiritual, right? It's more spiritual than it is what the person did, because all of a sudden we know the battle is really what's going on inside of me. This offense, I'm wrestling with it, I'm struggling with it, and that is the bigger battle. In Joseph's case, it would be very easy for him to carry offenses towards his brothers. It'd be very easy for him to carry an offense towards Potiphar's wife and to Potiphar himself, or get this, even an offense towards God. And for many of us, that's exactly what our offenses do. They end up being directed exactly at God, because he could have stopped this. And so I want to spend some time just before we close developing our understanding of the sovereignty of God, especially as it relates to offense. Because life is challenging. And one of the biggest challenges that we have to wrestle with and handle is when we have tried to do everything right and still things go bad. Is doing right worth it if it doesn't reward us? I mean, we've all asked that question. Is it really worth it? Like, I'm doing the right thing and I'm not getting ahead. Is doing the right thing even worth it? Well, I suppose it depends on why we are doing what is right. And if you're doing what is right to get rewarded, well, then certainly the answer is going to be, it's not always worth it. Because you can do the right thing and not get rewarded many times. And look at Joseph's life. He is sitting in prison because he did the right thing towards God, towards Potiphar, towards Potiphar's wife. And he did this, we see in Genesis 39:9, the motivation was this: how could I do an immense evil? And how could I sin against God? And this, though, when you've done the right thing and you're not seeing the reward, is when offenses look very appealing. We get mad at the people who wronged us, and it leads us right back to being angry with God. Listen, I know people who are so mad at God because they're not married. I mean, they spend all of their energy blaming God. God, you could make somebody love me. Why don't you do that? And you laugh, but I've had people tell me that. Like, where's God? He could make somebody do this. Or I've known people who are mad at God because of the person they married. So you got both ends of the spectrum. One person's mad at God because, they can't get married. The other person's mad at God because they got married. And God's like, I never win. They were like, you could have prevented it. You knew that down the road they might cheat on me or not be faithful. You knew. But you let me get married? Where are you, God? Or people blame God for their parents, or that they grew up poor, or that they didn't have the advantages that others did. But listen, Joseph did not go down this road. While he couldn't choose the things that happened to him, he chose his response to the things that did. And this is where we see character. We have that kind of character. We need that kind of character. We have that choice every time. We can't choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond to that happens to us. And when we have that as our character, if our main goal is to please God, guess what? No matter what we go through, we trust that God is in control. And so as we get to the end of the story, we get a glimpse at what's keeping Joseph in line this whole time from this offense. By the time Joseph is elevated, I want you to think about this. He's out of slavery finally. He's out of prison. Now he's second in charge of Egypt. And we're like, yes, that's what we want. We want to get there. And now he's revealed himself to his brothers. And what are they afraid of? Joseph is going to get us back. And he has all the power to do it. And why do they think that? Because that's what offended people do, right? Offended people get back at you. But Joseph says something else was guiding him. Look what he says in Genesis 50, 19 through 20. But Joseph said to him, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me, but God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." And this is huge, but don't sanitize it. He did not excuse their sin. He made it very clear. I know you planned it for evil. You wanted me dead. You wanted my life to be snuffed out. And here's the issue. Sometimes the people who have offended us, they wanted to harm us. But the key to not holding on to an offense against people are found in two words: but God. He trusted that God could turn it around. You meant it for evil, but God. You meant to hurt me. You meant to ruin my life. But God turned it around for his good and for his glory. And the result has been that many people have been saved because of it. I want you to think about some of the things they put Joseph through. They put him into a pit with the plan to kill him, but instead they sold him into slavery. But God used slavery to save Joseph's life. God used Potiphar to help Joseph learn the ways of Egypt. God used prison to set Joseph up and to be elevated into second command. And here's the deal. No one in this room would ever choose that path to greatness. Not one of us. The path to greatness is you're going to be a slave, you're going to be in prison, and then you're going to get to the top. And you're like, yeah, how's that going to happen? But God. But God. And you may look at your life right now and think nothing good is happening that could lead to anything good, but God. He has the final word. And if you can trust in the sovereignty of God, then you can know that God is in control. He can turn anything around that you're going through for his good. That's why Romans 8:28 is so much a cornerstone in my life. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that certainly doesn't mean that everything that happens is going to be good to us, but it does mean that God can turn it around for his good and for his glory. And through every affliction that Joseph went through, God was actually setting up Joseph to be in the perfect time and perfect place with the right character. And if God's able to do that with Joseph, he's certainly able to do that with you and me. And so as we close today, I know that the sovereignty of God is not always comforting and easy to lean into. But I would say this, some of that has to do with our misunderstanding of what God's sovereignty means. There's a big difference between asking, why did God do this to me, versus why did God allow this to happen? You see, many of us view God as being mean, like he's the one that did this to me when he allows us to suffer. Because again, he could change it all. So why did he do this? And so we view suffering as unloving. Whenever we suffer, it's like, God is not loving me right now. But that's not true. It's important to see that while God allows suffering into our lives, he is never the cause of that suffering. And so let me try to paint a picture that I hope helps us to see just how loving God is, even in the worst possible circumstances we walk through in life. As a father, if I were just to walk up to Levi and cause him harm for no reason and you saw that, you'd have every right to call the police on me, right? And report me. But if I take Levi to the park and I just let him have the space to run and play, and in the process of that, he falls and he gets hurt, it's not because I'm an unloving father. In fact, because I'm a loving father, I'm right there to scoop him up into my arms when he's hurt in those moments. And watch this, while he's in my arms, he may still be hurting, but he might also stop crying. Why? Because I'm there. I'm comforting him. And things are always better when you're in the arms of your Father. And so are you starting to get a picture of this? God allows you and me the space to go through this life, but often that space leads us to fall and get hurt. And sometimes we fall down and trip ourselves, and sometimes somebody pushes us, right? But our loving Father is right there in those moments to scoop us up into his loving arms. And we may still hurt. We may still have healing to do, but the things are better because we're in the arms of our Father. Well, there's one thing I can encourage you today is this. If you're hurting, don't push the Father away. Let him wrap you up and hold you. Because God can take all the hurts, and he can turn it around for his good. And that's why you and I don't have to take every offense that comes our way, because we know God has the final say. But you and I still have to be careful not to take the bait of offense. Here's why. If we take the bait of offense, it may keep us from the destiny God has for our lives. If Joseph had taken the bait, God would have never been able to promote him. You may not have ever thought about this, but if God elevated Joseph and he didn't have the character for it, how would have Joseph have used his power? The moment he saw his brothers, he would have used that to take revenge on them. And if he had taken revenge on his brothers, he would have wiped out 10 of the future tribes of Israel. Do you know what that would have meant? The tribe of Judah would have never existed, which was the line the future Savior would come through. But because his heart remained right, God used him to save not only his family, but ultimately us, the world, to bring salvation to all of us. And there is no way Joseph could have seen that. Remember this, Ephesians 3:20, he is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. And I want to tell you this, there is no way you can see what God is going to do through your life, but you can trust that it is good. And you could trust it is good, and therefore you're not going to take the bait that comes your way to be offended, because you know if I take that, it's going to hinder the plans that God has for me. And if you are going to choose better, you're going to have to then trust the offenses that come my way. God, they're yours to judge. You do a better job at it than I do, and you can take care of it. They may have intended it for evil, but God is more than able to turn it around and use it for his good and his glory. You and I, we just have to trust him. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for your word, and I thank you